For more than 20 years, the FBI searched for a traitor inside its own walls, a Russian mole. Someone with access to the most sensitive secrets in American counterintelligence. Someone who knew, every single day, exactly how the hunt was going. He knew because he was helping to run it. His name was Robert Hanssen, a special agent of the FBI, a devout Catholic, a father of 6, a man whose whole career was built on one thing: catching spies, and a private life that, in the end, matched none of it. How does a man like that become a traitor? How did he pass secrets to Moscow for 2 decades without a single colleague noticing? How was he finally caught? And what happened to him in the end? There is one more thing about Robert Hanssen. Almost every morning, he sat down at an FBI computer and searched the system for one name: his own. He wanted to know if they were finally closing in on him. To understand how the man hunting Russian spies became the most damaging Russian spy in the history of the FBI, you have to go back to a boy in Chicago who wanted, more than anything, to be someone else. Robert Hanssen grew up in the 1950s as the only son of a Chicago police officer. By most accounts, his father was a hard, contemptuous man who never seemed satisfied with him. Friends and psychiatrists who studied Hanssen later would keep returning to the same word: humiliation. A boy raised to feel small, who spent the rest of his life trying to prove he was the smartest person in any room, and who almost never told anyone what he was really thinking. He wanted to be in law enforcement. He was, as the man who later helped catch him would put it, a fanatic about spies. Eric O'Neill, the FBI operative who worked beside Hanssen in his final months, described him this way: "He really wanted to catch spies. He was a James Bond fanatic, loved the movies. He could quote them chapter and verse. He wanted to be a spy. He was joining the FBI to do that, not to spy against the US, but to go in and hunt spies." He joined the FBI in 1976. Within 3 years, he was assigned to a counterintelligence unit in New York, the exact place he had dreamed of being. And here's the first thing about this story that is hard to explain. He had everything he said he wanted, and almost immediately, he threw it away. In 1979, 3 years into his career, Hanssen walked into the New York offices of a Soviet trade company called Amtorg. Amtorg was a front. Behind it sat Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. Hanssen offered them his services. He was not recruited, not pressured, not blackmailed. He volunteered. He never gave a political reason. Years later, after he was caught, he told the FBI that his only motive had been money. But the amounts at first were small, about $20,000. For a man who supposedly did it for cash, he was selling the most valuable thing he would ever own for very little. And what he gave them was not small at all. During that first period, Hanssen handed the Soviets details of FBI surveillance work and lists of people the Americans suspected of being Soviet agents. His most damaging early betrayal, according to later accounts, was a man named Dmitry Polyakov, a general in Soviet military intelligence who had spent years secretly feeding enormous amounts of information to the United States. Polyakov was one of the most valuable sources American intelligence ever had. He was arrested in the 1980s, and in 1988, he was executed. Hanssen would not be the only American who betrayed Polyakov, but he was one of them. And that pattern, Hanssen handing over human beings, not just paper, is the part of this story that no talk of money can soften. Then, just as suddenly as he had started, he stopped. His wife, it is said, discovered a note and confronted him. Hanssen confessed to her, though not the full truth, and promised it was over. For a few years, it was. The mole went quiet, and the FBI never knew he had existed at all. But the quiet did not last, and what came next would make the first betrayal look like nothing. In 1985, Robert Hanssen came back. This time, he did not go to military intelligence. He wrote a letter to the KGB, the Soviet Union's main intelligence service. He signed it with a name that was not his, Ramon Garcia. For the next 6 years, that name, and only that name, was how Moscow knew him. This is one of the strangest details of the entire case. Hanssen never told the Soviets who he really was. He never met his handlers face to face. He gave them no name, no photograph, nothing that could identify him. He was a ghost, even to the people paying him. He was also, by now, in the perfect position to do damage. 1985 was the year he took over as supervisor of a technical surveillance squad. He had access to the FBI's deepest counterintelligence secrets: who the Americans had recruited, how they listened, where they were looking. And there was something Hanssen did not know at the time, something that makes this year almost unbelievable. He was not the only mole. At that very moment, inside the CIA, another American named Aldrich Ames was doing the same thing, selling the names of Soviet officials secretly working for the United States. Both men were paid by the KGB. Both men, according to later accounts, were run through the same senior KGB officer, Viktor Cherkashin. Two traitors in two different American agencies, betraying the same secrets to the same enemy at the same time, without either one knowing the other existed. Together, Ames and Hanssen exposed a group of Soviet officials who had been secretly working for American intelligence. Among the names Hanssen is known to have compromised were two KGB officers who had been recruited by the FBI in Washington, Valery Martinov and Sergei Motorin. Both men were called home to Moscow. Both were executed. Stop on that for a moment. The man whose job was to protect these sources handed their names to the people who would kill them. And when he was asked about it much later, there was no sign that it had ever kept him awake. The Justice Department would eventually describe the identities Hanssen gave up as dozens of human sources, at least 3 of whom were executed. But he did not stop at people. Hanssen revealed one of the FBI's most secret projects of the Cold War, a tunnel that American intelligence had built beneath the new Soviet embassy in Washington, wired to listen to everything said inside. It had cost a fortune and years of work. Hanssen told the Soviets it was there. From that point on, the Americans could never fully trust a word they heard through it. And then there was the darkest document of all. Hanssen gave Moscow the American plan for what the government would do in the event of a Soviet nuclear attack. How the leadership would survive, how the country would continue to function, how the United States would respond. In total, over the years, he passed the KGB something like 6,000 pages of classified material and dozens of computer disks. Weapons technology, counterintelligence methods, the machinery of American survival itself. For all of this, the man who said he did it for money was building up payments that would eventually total a small fortune. But he almost never spent it in ways anyone would notice. And that brings us to the strangest part of Robert Hanssen. Not what he did, but who he was while he did it. On the surface, Robert Hanssen was the last man in Washington you would suspect. He was a devout Roman Catholic and a member of Opus Dei, a strict and traditional movement within the church. He went to Mass, he prayed, he had 6 children. He talked loudly and often about the evils of communism and the moral rot he saw in his country. Colleagues found him difficult, cold, arrogant, the kind of man who lectured you and looked down on you. But a traitor was the last thing they imagined. He was, after all, one of the people whose job it was to find traitors. That was the disguise. Not a false name, not a wig, not a hidden apartment. His disguise was his own life. He was so obviously, aggressively loyal that no one thought to look twice. Underneath, the picture was much darker and much stranger. Hanssen's private life, according to what later came out, ran secretly against everything he preached in public, a hidden second self that his family and his church knew nothing about. We will leave it there. What matters for this story is the split. This was a man capable of living 2 completely opposite lives at once, and feeling, apparently, no contradiction between them. The two lives even touched his work in a way that is almost impossible to believe. For part of his career, Robert Hanssen helped hunt for a suspected Russian mole inside the American government. He sat in the meetings. He read the analysis. He knew what the FBI knew about the very kind of person he was. And so, he lived in fear. In his letters to the KGB, Hanssen returned again and again to the possibility of being caught. In one letter from 1986, he wrote a line that says everything about the man. Eventually, I would appreciate an escape plan. Nothing lasts forever. He asked his handlers, more than once, to warn him if the Americans ever got close. And almost every morning, he used his FBI access to search the Bureau's own computers, looking for his own name, his own address, any sign that the hunt had finally turned toward him. For years, it never did. And the question that has enraged American counterintelligence officers ever since is a simple one. How? How does a man betray his country for more than 20 years, from inside the very agency built to stop him, and never get caught? Part of the answer is uncomfortable, and it is the reason this is not really a story about one clever spy. It is a story about a system that could not see him. Hanssen was careful in ways most spies are not. He never told the Soviets his real name, so there was nothing to leak. He chose his own dead drop sites, hidden spots, usually under footbridges in parks near his home, and he controlled the timing. He almost never spent his money openly. He did not defect, did not brag, did not slip. He knew exactly how the FBI caught people, because catching them had been his job, and he simply did not make those mistakes. But there is more to it, and it is harder to forgive. For years, the FBI did not require its own agents to take lie detector tests the way the CIA did. The Bureau trusted its people. The idea that one of its own senior counterintelligence agents could be a Russian spy was, to many inside, almost unthinkable. And that refusal to think it was exactly the cover Hanssen needed. There was also his timing. Remember, Hanssen did not spy in one continuous stretch. He worked in bursts, the first from 1979 to 1981, the second from 1985 to 1991, and a final period beginning in 1999. In between, he went dark. When the Soviet Union collapsed, he grew frightened that his own file might turn up in the chaos, and he broke off contact completely. A spy who disappears for years is a spy who is very hard to find. And when the Americans finally understood that someone was still betraying them, they looked in the wrong place. After Aldrich Ames was arrested in 1994, some of the damage still did not add up. Secrets were being lost that Ames could not explain. So the hunt continued, but the investigators became convinced the mole was a CIA officer. For years, they chased the wrong man. An innocent officer had his life turned upside down, while the real traitor sat safely inside the FBI, reading about the investigation. By 1999, Robert Hanssen decided it was safe to come back one last time. He re-established contact with Russian intelligence, now called the SVR, and began passing secrets again. He was 55 years old, 2 years from mandatory retirement. He could have simply stopped, walked away clean, and taken his secret to the grave. Instead, he picked up exactly where he had left off, and this time, without knowing it, he was running out of road. The break did not come from brilliant detective work inside the FBI. It came from a file. By the late 1990s, American intelligence had concluded that the only way to find the mole was to buy the answer. And so, in an operation that still sounds astonishing, the FBI paid a former Russian intelligence source a reported $7 million for one thing: the original Russian file on their American spy. The file did not contain a name. Hanssen had been too careful for that. But it contained other things. It held a recording of the spy's voice, made during a phone call to his handlers years earlier. And it held physical materials the spy had handled, including a trash bag, the kind Hanssen used to wrap his dead drops. When American investigators listened to the recording, several of them recognized the voice, and when they examined the bag, they found fingerprints. The fingerprints belonged to a veteran FBI counterintelligence agent named Robert Hanssen. The ghost finally had a face. But knowing who he was and proving it in a way that would hold up were two different things. To catch Hanssen in the act, the FBI would have to bring the most dangerous spy in its history closer than ever, right into the heart of headquarters, under a microscope, without letting him feel the glass. In December of 2000, the FBI made Robert Hanssen an offer that looked like the crowning moment of his career. They told him he was being promoted, a senior new position at FBI headquarters with a fine office and an important-sounding title overseeing information security. To Hanssen, the arrogant man who had always believed he was smarter than the people above him, it must have felt like overdue recognition. In reality, it was a cage. The office was wired with hidden cameras. His every move was watched. His coworkers were reporting on him, and the FBI assigned a young surveillance specialist to sit just outside his door, posing as his assistant. That young man was Eric O'Neill. Officially, he was Hanssen's clerk. Really, he was there to watch him, to get close to him, and when the moment came, to get him out of his office long enough for the FBI to search it. O'Neill spent weeks beside a man he knew was a traitor, pretending to admire him, absorbing his lectures, watching him pray and rage and boast. It is this strange, tense relationship between the old spy and the young operative that later became the basis for the film Breach. O'Neill saw the human being underneath, and what he described was not a mastermind, but a wound that had never healed. In his account, Hanssen was a man who had always wanted to be the great spy hunter, who was furious that the FBI had never given him the role he believed he deserved, and who was, at the same time, straining under the cost of raising a large family. O'Neill put it bluntly. Hanssen, he said, decided that he was going to get everything he wanted, become a spy. There it is. Not money alone, not ideology, he never had any. What the people closest to the case describe is a mixture. Wounded pride, a bottomless need to prove he was the cleverest man in the building, the ordinary pressure of bills and children, and a thrill he could not get any other way. The thrill of beating, in secret, the very institution that he felt had failed to appreciate him. Money was the trigger he named. It was never the whole gun. The psychiatrist who spent about 100 hours with Hanssen after his arrest, Dr. David Charney, came to a similar conclusion. He believed the roots of Hanssen's betrayal lay not in greed, but in ego, in an unbearable, lifelong sense of personal failure, and in the way Hanssen had defined those failures for himself since boyhood. A man convinced he was extraordinary, terrified that he was nothing, who found, in treason, the one arena where he could always win. By February of 2001, the FBI had watched long enough. They knew Hanssen was still active. They knew he was planning another drop. All they needed was to catch him doing it. On the evening of February 18, 2001, Robert Hanssen drove to Foxstone Park near his home in Vienna, Virginia. It was a site he had used before, one he called Ellis. He parked on a quiet residential street and walked down a wooded path to a small footbridge over a creek. In his hands was a sealed garbage bag filled with classified documents. He taped it to the underside of the bridge, exactly as he had done so many times over so many years. He did not know that the trees around him were full of FBI agents. As Hanssen turned and walked back toward his car, the arrest team moved in. There was no struggle, no chase, no attempt to run. According to the agents there that night, Hanssen looked at them and asked a single question. A question that told them he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. What took you so long? The FBI did not announce it right away. For 2 more days, agents watched the park, waiting to see if any of Hanssen's Russian handlers would come to collect the package. None did. On February 20th, the Bureau went public. The FBI director Louis Freeh stood before the press and called Hanssen's actions the most traitorous imaginable for an agent of the FBI. The Justice Department would later describe the case as possibly the worst intelligence disaster in the history of the United States. Now the man who had spent his life fascinated by spies faced the ending he had spent years quietly dreading. Espionage on this scale, including the betrayal of human sources who were later killed, can carry the death penalty. On paper, Robert Hanssen was a candidate for execution. He did not get it, and the reason is the same uncomfortable bargain that runs through so many of these cases. To avoid the death penalty, Hanssen agreed to a deal. He would plead guilty and he would submit to months of debriefing, telling the FBI in detail everything he had done, what he had taken, how he had taken it, which secrets were gone. The Americans needed that damage assessment badly because for 20 years they had not even known what they had lost. His life was the price they paid to find out. On July 6, 2001, Robert Hanssen pleaded guilty to 15 criminal counts, 13 of espionage, 1 of attempted espionage, and 1 of conspiracy. On May 10, 2002, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He forfeited his FBI pension. And investigators calculated that over the years, Moscow had paid him roughly $1.4 million in cash, diamonds, and funds set aside in a Russian bank. Money he had, for the most part, never even touched. He was sent to the federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, the most secure facility in the country, and placed in near total isolation, alone in a small cell for most of every day. The James Bond fanatic, who had wanted, above all, to matter, spent the last 2 decades of his life in a concrete room where almost no one ever saw him. On June 5, 2023, guards found Robert Hanssen unresponsive in that cell. He was 79 years old. He died the way he had lived his secret life, alone and unseen. He never fully explained himself. He gave the money answer, and then the deeper answers came from the people who studied him rather than from the man himself. And that is what makes Robert Hanssen so hard to close the book on. Aldrich Ames, his fellow mole, at least fit a simple story, a man drowning in debt who sold out for cash. Hanssen fit no simple story at all. A believer who betrayed his faith's most basic loyalty. A spy hunter who was the spy. A father of 6 who handed strangers the names of men he knew would be shot. Here is the question worth sitting with. For more than 20 years, one man walked through the middle of American intelligence, betraying it completely, and no colleague, no priest, no neighbor, no member of his own family ever saw the second life underneath. And it raises something more than a question about him. It raises a question about all of us. How well do we really know the people we trust the most? So what was Robert Hanssen? A brilliant operator who fooled the most powerful law enforcement agency on Earth for 2 decades from the inside and nearly took the secret to his grave? Or a small, wounded man who sold human lives for cash and diamonds he never even spent, just to feel, for once, like the most important person in the room? Tell us what you think in the comments.